over to Chris. I just need to do a little bit of admin behind the scenes so that he has presenter rights, and it's now over to Chris. Thank you.
There we go. I have control. Thanks very much, Rob, for that generous introduction. I'll talk to you later about whether I'm technically a guru or not, but I'll take it just for now. So thanks very much for involving me in this series of seminars. And I really wanted to share something which I've seen over the years from my time working with networks and with more with a specific type of network, a community of practice, where there is a kind of a mutual commitment to learn and improve and a shared passion or a concern for something that people do as a common practice. So I'm kind of using that as my background for this. And I wanted to take you through some of the things which I've seen that get in the way of successful communities and networks. What are some of the behavioral challenges which can just hold things up? And I've characterized them, as you'll have seen from the very well communicated briefings, as the 7 deadly syndromes or the 7 deadly sins, depending on how you want to work it. I'm going to go through each one. My plan is to take you through each of the syndromes and explain what you observe. And as I'm going through those, just invite you to consider which ones do I see at work in a network that I'm a member of or a network that I lead. When I've been through all 7, you'll get a chance to vote on the ones you see most active in the networks that you're involved with. And then after that, I'll maybe take you through 1 or 2 antidotes to the syndromes, things that you might want to think about doing if you see some of these syndromes at work in your networks. So without further ado, let me take you through some of my 7 deadly syndromes. And I think as we work with networks or communities, we're always conscious that we're dealing with people's discretionary time. So for that to work, I think for most people, there needs to be a sense of reciprocity, a bit of give and take, a bit of a marketplace, if you like, a supply and demand. And the first 4 of the 7 syndromes address different sides of that supply and demand marketplace. So syndrome number 1 is tall poppy syndrome. Okay, tall poppy syndrome is really based on the principle that the poppy that grows tallest is the first poppy that gets cut down. So you could also call this one kind of don't put your head above the parapet syndrome. It's something that just makes people think twice before they volunteer particular insight, knowledge, experience, a lesson learned into that kind of empty room of a network discussion or a network meeting if you get the chance to meet face to face. It just makes me actually, maybe I won't. Because what's going on in the background might be a little set of conversations that go a bit like this. Well, if I say I've got a good practice to share or a great story to share, then maybe some of my colleagues might just want to cut me down to size. Maybe I'll discover that my good practice wasn't so much of a good practice after all, and it's been done by many people for much time. So you know what? I think I'm just going to keep my head down. It's just a little bit too risky to be that tall poppy, to be volunteering stuff, which I thought was useful. I don't want to take the chance. So you just keep your head down and carry on doing things the way you've always done. So that's tall poppy syndrome, and it stifles the supply of knowledge and learning and insight and all the good stuff we want to see surfacing. If people are just wary of not wanting to be the tall poppy. I did some work with a group of lawyers a few months ago, and one of them said, in our firm, we say it's being preachy. And nobody wants to be the preachy lawyer in that firm. So hopefully you get the idea. That's tall poppy syndrome. It stifles the supply of knowledge. Another one, which is a bit more subtle, which also stifles the supply of knowledge and learning, I call this one shrinking violet syndrome. Now, at this point, I'm waiting for somebody in the chat to point out gently that that is actually an anemone rather than a violet, but I'm going to go with it anyway because it's a nice picture. But shrinking violet syndrome is almost an unhelpful, overworked kind of humility, almost like a false humility, if you like. That, well, we've got nothing to share from our perspective. We don't have any good practices to share with the network because we're ever so humble. And actually, sometimes people just don't realize that they have good practices to share, so they remain hidden away. They don't have a frame of reference that says actually the way we do this particular thing, this practice, which is important to our network or community, is actually quite distinctive. So maybe we should be sharing it, but you get this kind of unwarranted kind of Uriah Heep mindset that we're ever so humble and we'll leave it to the other people, the more vociferous ones in the network, who are always the ones who are kind of sharing the good stuff. So you've got kind of buried treasure, if you like, in your network that you never quite find because they're just a bit too shy, a bit too humble, and sometimes they don't realize that they've got great stuff to share because there is no common language, no frame of reference that they could suddenly understand how good they are. So that also stifles the supply side. Now let's just pause for a moment and imagine that in our network or community garden, we could manage it such that the tall poppies felt it was safe to come out into the sunshine and share stuff. And the shrinking violets suddenly realized that they had good things to share and also wanted to come out and offer up their great insights to the rest of the network. So if we could do that with our garden. But now imagine that nobody wants to walk around the garden, nobody wants to pick the flowers or smell the flowers. Then all we've done is stimulate the supply side for knowledge and learning, but we've done nothing to balance that by addressing some of the suppressants that are on the demand side. So we can stock up our knowledge flows, our good practices, but if no one's reading, if no one's interested, then we're kind of just building out banks of knowledge that are maybe going to be less used than we might like to. So let's take a look at the other side of the marketplace then. What stifles the demand side for knowledge and what can we do about that? So syndrome number 3 is not invented here syndrome. So this is a classic syndrome that I'm sure you'll be familiar with. So not invented here syndrome it kind of comes out in the word, but we're different. But we have unique problems. When you've worked in this particular trust, Chris, for 10 years, then you'll understand why we've got this kind of very special culture here. And all of the things that have worked elsewhere would never work. So that's not invented here syndrome. And sometimes, you know, what lies behind this kind of we're different, we have unique problems challenge is, you know, what we quite like coming up with unique solutions. Maybe we get more kudos from other network members or more kudos in our organization by coming up with an innovative solution than we do from reusing what's gone before or building on an idea from somewhere else. So not invented here syndrome is the kind of the enemy of curiosity. It doesn't allow people to hold on to some ambiguity and to wonder about things and just to wonder whether there's a solution in there. There's a really powerful story, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where Professor Martin Elliott in Great Ormond Street Hospital allowed himself to wonder at the end of a long night surgery, heart surgery. He's the chair of cardiothoracic surgery at Great Ormond Street and UCL and UCH. And he just finished his operations and switched on the TV and noticed the Grand Prix there, and he noticed a pit stop. And at that moment in time, he wondered whether or not the way in which the pit team in the Ferrari team and the way they managed their operational processes, if you like, so efficiently, so fail safely, for such a word as that, he wondered whether there was something that could be translated into the operating theatre, and then had the courage of his convictions to ask his colleagues to check that out and to invite them in. And there was a great little exchange around the use of rehearsal and the use of knowledge sharing. So he was sufficiently curious to allow that to happen. And not invented here syndrome is the enemy of curiosity. It's almost like the antibodies that reject organs when you have an organ transplant. And it's as though people are so charged up with antibodies that they can't listen to or entertain the idea that something coming from outside of their regular environment is going to be of value. So not invented here syndrome. I think I've beaten up on that one enough probably. Also stifles the demand side. Something else that stifles the demand side for knowledge and learning and insights. This one I call real men don't ask directions syndrome. Now that's a terrible slur on all men and a terrible stereotype, which of course is not rooted in any kind of science. But the theory is that that men are more reluctant to ask for help when we're lost. And hence we kind of muddle through, find our own way through, or we covertly use technology to kind of get our directions, and on we go. Now, organizationally or in a network context, what's going on here is someone saying, well, I've got a problem or a challenge, and I'm not quite sure how to address this, but you know what? I don't want to be seen to be parading my incompetence in front of my peers. That's just a little bit embarrassing for me. So you know what? I'm going to kind of muddle through. And then when I've solved my problem, I'll be delighted to share my solution, because I don't have a problem with tall poppy syndrome, but I'm slightly reticent to be seen to be the one who's asking for help. And I quite often get asked by organizations to come and address knowledge sharing problems. Chris, can you come in with a knowledge sharing problem in our network or in our organization or in some other functional group? And often it comes down to something which isn't at all about a knowledge sharing problem. It's actually an asking problem. And the process of asking for help, which is what Tom-Tom syndrome, rear mind ask direction syndrome is all about, is the thing which is getting in the way. It doesn't feel safe to ask for help. It doesn't feel professionally safe for me to be the one asking. I look needy. I look vulnerable, maybe. And there's maybe an underlying slightly macho culture that makes that difficult. So that's Tom-Tom syndrome or rear mind ask direction syndrome. And that is also something which stifles the demand side for knowledge and learning. So let's move on to syndrome number 5. So syndrome number 5, I call this one, you can guess from the picture, I call this one lacknowledgement. Okay, so acknowledgement with an L across the front. And I think networks, communities, any kind of informal kind of network society relies on acknowledgement and people being credited for the things which they are providing. And the minute someone starts, the minute there's asymmetry in that you're giving and giving, but somebody else is taking the credit, then that can generate problems in a network. So we need to pay attention to the level of acknowledgement and maybe find a way to call people out or behind the scenes nurture people when there's a lack of credit. We've all felt that indignation when we see our work recast with somebody else's name on it, or just recast with nobody's name on it, but certainly not our name on it. And that can be quite a destructive emotion to have kind of brewing with network members. So acknowledgement is important. Acknowledgement is a sin or a syndrome that we need to think about. So that's syndrome number 5. Then moving on to syndrome number 6. This one, I call this one lock it away syndrome. So lock it away syndrome is it's kind of a, well, you know what happens. Somebody would say, well, I'd love to share this with you, Chris, but I'm not sure it's quite finished and it's not quite perfect, and I haven't quite got clearance to do this. But once it's all sort of sorted and so on, then of course I'm very happy to talk to you about it, but I can't really talk about it right now. And of course, behind all these locked doors in our organizations, there are potentially stuff going on in parallel that could really benefit us, only if we knew what was going on. But because of maybe overworked concerns around security policies, they can cast a very long shadow on all forms of sharing because they kind of create a bit of a distortion in the system. Now, of course, we need information security, don't get me wrong, but this is the point where it becomes a slightly distorted scenario, and so everything gets locked down by default rather than everything is open by default, and this it needs to be locked away. So lock it away syndrome is where kind of the information security policy and maybe other cultural reasons just suppress people sharing it for whatever reason it might be. Often it masquerades behind there, well, I'd love to, but I don't really have permission and it's not perfect. So I'll share it a bit later on. That's number 6 rather. And finally, number 7 is hamster on the wheel syndrome. Okay, hamster on the wheel syndrome manifests itself as people saying, well, all this sounds great, Chris, but you have no idea how busy we are. We don't have time for all this kind of learning and sharing in our network. We're just so busy with the day-to-day stuff, and it can feel a little bit like a hamster on a wheel, where the hamster is actually driving the wheel themselves. And even though intellectually we know that asking for help or looking to reuse something that somebody else has done could save us huge amounts of time, sometimes we feel we lack the headroom, the headspace to even make that step into knowledge sharing and knowledge reuse. Meanwhile, we just keep running along the wheel like this particularly fat hamster. So hamster on the wheel syndrome is one of the ones which just kind of gets in the way of everything. Well, when a quieter day comes, then of course we'll do some of this stuff. But right now, you just have no idea how busy we are. We don't have time to do any of this stuff. When I worked in BP as part of their knowledge management team, somebody said to the head of that team, we just don't have time for this knowledge management thing, this knowledge sharing thing. And the guy who led the team, Kent, said to them, well, do you have the time to halve the time? And if we really believed that sharing, reusing knowledge would open up time in our diaries, we might be more likely to do this. So hamster on the wheel syndrome is actually not so much a lack of time. It's a lack of faith or belief or willingness to make the first move and just see if by doing this thing, I can actually save myself time and recover more than it cost me in the first place. So that's hamster on the wheel syndrome, which also stifles sharing, learning, reuse of knowledge in any context, particularly in a network context. Now, in a minute, we're going to get a chance to vote on some of these. I'll just put back a little summary for you, and I'll just do a very quick recap. One organisation I work with quite like these syndromes, and they added one or two of their own special ones, and I'm sure you're thinking of special syndromes in your organisation too, or your network too. But they actually produce some little pocket cards, business card style things with the images on. And if they're in a meeting and somebody begins to exhibit one of these behaviours, one of these syndromes, so they'll literally play it. I'll put it in front of the person and say, come on, Rob, don't be such a shrinking violet. You know you've got some good stuff to share. There's no reason why that couldn't happen digitally as well. And there's something about recognizing and with a little bit of good humor calling out the behaviors that can help begin to address some of these things. So that might be something you want to think about. So quick recap and to help you make your mind up, and then I'm going to hand over, I think, to Georgina, who's going to take us through the poll process, which is a mystery to me. So I'm going to hand over to someone who knows what they're doing. So quick recap: tall poppy syndrome. Poppy that grows tallest is the first one that gets cut down. Don't put your head above the parapet. Don't be preachy. Just keep your head down. Stifles the supply of knowledge. Shrinking violet. Didn't realize I had a good practice to share. I'm ever so humble. There's always somebody else who does it better than me. So I'll just kind of, I'll leave that for somebody else. Also stifles the supply of knowledge. Non-vegeteer syndrome. We're different, unique problems. Secretly quite like coming up with unique solutions. Less kudos involved in reusing knowledge than there is in maybe inventing stuff, in quotes. Tom-Tom syndrome. This macho culture, I don't want to be seen to be the one who's saying, I don't know how to do this. I'm not prepared to risk parading my incompetence in front of my peers. I don't want to be seen to be needy. Not really comfortable asking for stuff. So I'm not up for that. Okay, it's also stifles the demand for knowledge. Then lack acknowledgement, this lack of crediting other people where you are reusing what they do. Lock it away syndrome, the distorted perspective of, or the distorted application of an information security policy or some other legal reason why I'm really sorry I couldn't even talk to you about this thing. And then finally, hamster on the wheel syndrome, we're just too busy for this stuff. When the quieter day comes, then we'll be able to just maybe begin to try some of these things out in our network. Okay, so that was my recap. We'll pause now for a vote, and then after the vote, I'll use a little bit of time to take you through maybe one or two potential antidotes to these things. Okay, so I'm not quite sure where we see the results of the poll. I'm going to leave it to someone who knows what they're doing to tell me at this point. Ah, there we go. Look at that. So the biggies were, you know, it's always this one. Hamster on the wheel syndrome is always the biggest. I've done this, I use these 7 syndromes in so many organizations, and you better believe it, everybody thinks they're just as busy as you are. But I'm sure you are actually much busier. But hamster on the wheel was our big one. Then if we move back, lock it away was an issue for some people, 16%. So it'd be interesting to unpack that a little bit. What are the perceived barriers around our permission to share, and at what point can we share stuff? And then if I go back to the very beginning, it looks like if you take the first 2 syndromes as being kind of barriers to the supply of knowledge, and then the next 2 more on the demand side, we're slightly more, very slightly more constrained for supply than we are for demand. But not hugely. We're pretty much a basket case, really, aren't we, in terms of all the stuff going on in our networks. And the least 2, at least something we can take some pride on. So we seem to have reduced the kind of machismo in our networks. TomTom syndrome isn't too much of an issue, and this lack of acknowledgement problem seems to be not too much of a problem either. So I guess something to take some heart from there. So it'd be great to unpack a bit more of that later on. Now, let me give you, I guess, a few antidotes. I'm not claiming this. There were real antidotes for these things that could completely eradicate them, then I probably would have retired by now. But these are some things that I've seen which are helpful. So let me just take you through a few examples of things that I would do. If I was leading a network or community of practice and I saw kind of one of these syndromes as a big deal, and it's great to have a discussion with your network about the syndromes that might be at play, because recognizing these things is the first stage of beginning to do something about it. So, tall poppy syndrome, I know that was relevant for some of you. For me, this is all about creating psychological safety, making it safe to share stuff. In terms of simple steps, sometimes networks have a process of what they call hot seats or spotlights, whereby everybody gets to take their turn. So, you know, this Monday, it's going to be Matthew in the hot seat. So Matthew gets to say a bit about what he's doing. And because everybody gets a turn, you don't get that sense that you're the only tall poppy. You don't get that sense of isolation or vulnerability, because you know that everyone has there's a kind of an equality and everyone gets their turn. Another process that people use is a thing called offers and requests. So you say to your network, we'd love you all to think about one thing or 2 things you can offer the network, 2 good practices or great examples that you have, and also 2 requests or 1 request, something you'd love to get back from the network. And again, because there's a sense that, well, hang on, if everybody has got an offer or a request, and we'll come back to whether requests come in a moment, if everyone's got an offer, then I should have an offer too. So again, it's making it safer. It's taking that sense of isolation away. There's another thing that is actually in it's something the semantics and the language we use. I used to lead some networks in BP when I worked there, and one of the networks that was in our kind of our portfolio of networks had a Q&A response type discussion forum, questions and answers, and we found that actually the label of answers was a barrier to people. Some people were okay to ask questions. Those people who didn't have TomTom syndrome. But when it came to providing answers, that word answers was a barrier to them. And when we swapped the word barrier, the word answer rather, for the word response, we found the number of responses we got went up quite a lot. Because actually, for me to offer a response to somebody else's issue or challenge is much safer than me offering an answer or a solution, because I'm not wrapping it up as the answer. I'm just saying, look, this worked for me. Here's my response to your challenge. So sometimes if you've got the word answer in a forum somewhere, or you're requesting answers for questions, you might find that just playing around with the language a bit can help in some ways. Just talking briefly about what about getting people to become tall poppies, talking about things that have gone wrong, talking about failures. There's a nice little process which I've been using, was one of the talent management networks communities as part of the London Leadership Academy, and they created, rather than talking about their failures in talent management and the health service, because that's an awkward thing to do, they worked together, the number of people in the network, to build together what they call the How to Sabotage Talent Management and How to Sabotage Culture in the health service, and created literally a sabotage manual, all the things you'd need to do if you were secretly trying to sabotage talent management in the health service. And of course, within that sabotage manual, rather, all the truth of what's gone wrong is in there, but it's not attributed directly to an individual, so they're much more comfortable sharing it. And of course, all you need to do then is take the sabotage manual and flip it around into a things that we should do manual. So again, making it psychologically safe to share good stuff or to share stuff which has gone wrong are some of the ways of addressing tall poppy syndrome. Shrinking violet syndrome, I think one of the biggest barriers to this is this idea that I didn't know that I was good at this stuff. I didn't know I had a good practice to share. I don't have a kind of a framework or a frame of reference to address this. And one of the techniques that I've used quite a lot, and you'll be aware of it because those of you who are aware of the framework, the maturity model around networks, it is exactly doing one of those. So for whatever practice is important for your network, maybe you're leading an infection control network or something like that, it's getting the network to agree amongst themselves a model of what good looks like, a maturity model for infection control. So let's agree together. Maybe something you want to do face-to-face, have a workshop, get people to share their stories of infection control, derive from those stories a set of common themes or practices, and then build maybe a 1 to 5 scale, 1 to 5 maturity model that describes what good looks like. And then you've got a model which can be used by anybody in the network to say, well, actually, we're better than we thought. We're actually level 4 or level 5 on that. Had no idea about that. We should be sharing that. So the idea of a common language, a framework, a maturity model is a great way of unlocking great practice from people who had no idea that they had some good stuff to share. So that can be an important one for shrinking violet syndrome. So it's kind of using positive deviance, if you like, to help people spot where they've got something good to share. And at a much more trivial level, a bit like the offers and requests, run a knowledge market when you come together and ask everyone to prepare a poster of a good practice that they feel proud of. And again, because everyone's doing it, it causes the shrinking violets to think a bit more deeply about, well, there must be something we can share, and it helps them just overcome that inertia. So that's a couple of ideas to stimulate and address some of the supply side issues. Let's move across quickly to the demand side. Tom-Tom syndrome. This is about balance. How can we make it easy for people to ask for help, and how can we make it easy for people to be curious and apply it? There's something about celebrating where people are good at reusing things. Syngenta, big agrochemicals company, they put in place a number of awards for knowledge sharing in their communities and networks, and they had 4 different kinds of awards which they used, and they spell out the word tree. So each award stands for a different kind of behavior. So the first one was the transfer award, transferring a good practice. So someone who's gone out of their way to share, to transfer a good practice with somebody else in the network, and it's been applied and created value or made a difference, they'd be eligible for the transfer award. And these look like little glass paperweights with trees etched in them by lasers. And then the second award was the reuse award. So it was reusing a good practice. And that was the award they gave out, which was designed to overcome not invented here syndrome. If I'm going to get a nice little award to stick on my desk if I'm reusing, stealing with pride, somebody else's idea, but acknowledging them as we get to that one, then I'm more likely to do it. So just acknowledging good practices. The other 2 awards in the tree awards stood for embed a good practice, as someone who's embedding creating a knowledge product that can be reused by the network, or curating content around a critical theme. And the final one was Share a Difficult Experience Award, which is about sharing a failure. So that was beginning to address bits of tall poppy syndrome as well. So that's a few around this issue around not invented here syndrome. There's also something about working out loud, to be honest. The more we can encourage people to work out loud and share stuff early on, then people don't get entrenched in the idea that they're pursuing, and they're more willing to to think about what others are doing. So anything we can do in terms of small micro-blogging what we're doing within the network makes it more likely that people will pick up someone else's idea early enough that they're not entrenched in their solution and not willing to do that. So moving along to Tom-Tom syndrome, making it safe to ask for help. How can we do that? Again, offers and requests are great for that. If everybody has got a request, every member of the network has been asked to bring out their request, and suddenly I feel less vulnerable. However macho I might feel, because all my colleagues are doing it, it's actually more embarrassing for me not to have a request than it is for me to have a request. So you're kind of reversing the peer pressure to encourage everyone to do that. Things like randomized coffee trials can be quite nice in terms of just serendipitously connecting me with somebody. If there's a sense of randomization in it, again, it's taking the onus of me being needy or me asking. I'm just connected by somebody at random. We're doing this quite actively within the Q community. Matthew, who I think is on this chat, is helping coordinate that. So every month I get connected as a member of the Q community that Health Foundation runs. I get connected with another member of the community, and in our chat, inevitably, we'll talk about the stuff that we want some help with, the stuff that's keeping us awake at night, the stuff that's on our desk right now. But just that little intervention, somebody else has made the connection for me. I didn't have to ask, somebody connected me, can be really helpful. Of course, there is another option, which is that we load our networks with more women than men. That's another option that we could look at, but that's probably a little on the social engineering side of things. And the other thing I think is if you have a sponsor for your network, it's just using them wisely in terms of getting them to both role model and encourage and celebrate where people are willing to ask for help. I think asking for help can be the biggest one. This whole that can unlock. If we can make it safe for people to ask for help, then I think knowledge is much more naturally going to flow from those who have it to those who need it. But if there's no articulated need, if we can't make it safe and easy and emotionally safe for people to share a need, then knowledge is going to stay bound up and we have unrequited needs. Lack acknowledgement, a fairly obvious one really. I think the more we can kind of role model this as network leaders, always paying attention to name check people. One of the things I do with communities and networks quite early on is to encourage people to bring their favorite 2 or 3 documents. What are the things that are on that thumb drive, that memory stick, that wherever you go to, you're going to be using that, because there's a really good templates, examples, contracts, models, PowerPoint slides, whatever it might be. And if you can get your network members to bring those out, have a bit of an amnesty for the good stuff at one of your first meetings, either virtually or face-to-face, and then kind of curate those into some kind of a shared library, then you've already started the ball rolling. So you've got a list of all these wonderful documents and the person who brought them. So right from the day one of your network, from the launch party, if you like, when you've suddenly built this great library of good stuff because everyone's brought something, and it's got a name associated with it, you're setting the ground rules. So you know what? Whenever there's good stuff, we want to put someone's name by. We always want to have that connection between the content and the individual. Moving on, lock it away syndrome. I guess it's a fairly obvious one, really. Check what the information security policy actually says and communicate it as widely as you can around the net, because sometimes we live under false pretenses as to what actually is permissible, and that then becomes the dominant culture in a network. I think, again, working out loud is helpful here, getting people just to share the smallest of status updates. This is what I'm working on. And then allowing someone to pick up on that and maybe have a more informal conversation, a conversation which isn't subject to freedom of information, but it might enable them just to make a connection. So you're not breaching confidentiality, you're just saying enough about what you're doing to make that work. What else did I have against this one? I think there's also something about increasing the level of requests for help. So this is where these things begin to come together a little bit. So the more you can make it safe and easy to ask for help, the more people are likely to say, well, actually, I have got something that would be really useful to that person. I might have been a bit nervous about sharing it, but now I can see this demand for it. This person who I could really help with this. I'm more likely to offer it up and find a way around whatever perceived information security issue there might be. So increasing the bandwidth of the need will make it somehow psychologically bring through stuff that might otherwise just be stockpiled. And finally, this whole idea about hamster on the wheel, this how do we overcome the whole busyness thing? If your network has a sponsor, again, you're having some words from a sponsor or a senior person to legitimize the time spent on networking, to kind of celebrate where it works. Find stories where it's made a difference, because there's nothing works better than a story of someone who asked a question in the network, found something, they applied it, and suddenly it solved that problem that had been taking them, keeping them late at work or taking up their weekends. If you can get those stories and video them, celebrate them to death, because you need those stories. They give you credibility with senior managers, they provide the air cover for people to participate, and they just build a level of faith that there's something useful in that, and just counter some of the skepticism. So find those examples, and award schemes are great for pulling out the examples. Syngenta, we mentioned earlier, with their Tree Awards, they give out 30 awards every quarter to they've got about 20 networks that they run in their business. So 30 awards going across 20 networks every quarter, 120 every year. They've done it for 7 years now, which means they've got 800 stories, real stories of people, personalities, needs, examples, resolution, and happy customers or better products or better outcomes, which is an amazing library that they can draw on. If anyone ever says, why do you spend time on these networks? It's just a talking shop, isn't it? Well, actually, here's a whole bunch of stories that demonstrate pretty unequivocally the difference that makes. So those are just a brainstorm of potential antidotes, but I'm sure you have some antidotes, and the chat has been flashing out while I've been talking, and I probably need to catch up on what was there. So let me pause a little bit and hand back to whoever is going to pick up the chair from the Software Networks team.